At the age of 68, Nick Faldo is still remembered as one of the greatest icons in the history of golf, the man who redefined the standards of excellence through discipline and near absolute precision. With 6 major titles of feat, that very few golfers in history have come close to, including 3 victories at the Open Championship in 1987, 1990, and 1992, along with 3 wins at the Masters Tournament in 1989, 1990, and especially 1996, where he created one of the most astonishing comebacks of all time by overcoming Greg Norman on a legendary Sunday. In addition, he won more than 30 professional titles around the world, held the world #1 ranking for many weeks, was a cornerstone of the European team in the Ryder Cup, and later became its captain, was inducted into the World Golf Hall of Fame, and was knighted by the British monarchy. All those achievements not only confirmed his talent, but also turned him into a symbol of precision, strategy, and a standard of play that the whole world had to learn from. A man who not only won but also changed the way people understand elite golf. But behind those titles was a journey that was never easy, where every victory came with invisible pressures and nameless losses. Nick Faldo was not someone blessed with superior natural talent, but a man who pushed himself to the limit with almost ruthless willpower. He once completely dismantled his own technique and rebuilt it from scratch under the guidance of David Ledbetter, accepting the trade-off in form, reputation, and stability just to pursue perfection. He practiced to the point of isolating himself from the world, putting his career above relationships, so that the brilliant successes were accompanied by voids in his personal life, broken relationships, distance from those around him, and a constant need to control everything. He did not allow himself to be weak, did not allow himself to stop, and that created a man so strong he became cold. A legend respected but forced to live with the price of the greatness he had chosen. Before continuing the journey behind those victories, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to honor the man who paid so much to stand at the top. But to understand why Nick Faldo became the man he is, we need to go back to the very early years of his life. A childhood that did not contain dramatic tragedies or major shocks that could be easily told, but carried a silent kind of void that not everyone noticed. He was born into a middle-class family in England, where everything seemed materially sufficient but lacked deep emotional connection, with no inspiring stories, no one guiding him toward a specific path, and certainly no one placing a golf club in his hands or telling him that would be his future. Nick Faldo did not grow up in the light of expectations, but in a rather quiet space where he had to observe for himself, understand for himself, and gradually shape himself. And that very lack of direction did not weaken him, but taught him very early that if he wanted to become someone, he would have to find the path on his own, without waiting, without depending, without relying on anyone. The moment that changed everything came quite by chance, when the boy first saw the Masters tournament on television. No one explained to him the meaning of the tournament. No one told him that what he was watching was the pinnacle of the sport, full of discipline and pressure. But in the eyes of a child, something touched him. Not the glamour, but the stillness, the precision, and the way each shot seemed to carry the full concentration of the person standing behind it. From that moment, a very clear thought formed in his mind. That was what he wanted to do. Not for anyone else, but simply because he felt he belonged to it. There was no ready-made path laid out. Nick Faldo began playing golf almost from zero, teaching himself, observing himself, correcting himself, and in the process, he gradually built a very special relationship with himself, where he became his own only teacher, his own only critic, and his own only motivator. There was no pampering, no constant encouragement, only repetition, persistence, and a very clear feeling that if he did not do it, no one would do it for him. This created an almost absolute habit of self-reliance, a way of existing where he did not need external validation to keep moving forward. But at the same time, it also began to create a distance that he himself probably did not realize at the time. While other children were still living in friendships, games, and the natural connections of childhood, Faldo spent more time practicing, thinking about every small detail in his swing, repeating movements that no one required him to do. And gradually his world narrowed, not because he was forced, but because he chose it himself, a very quiet choice, but one with influence that lasted his entire life. He did not reject people, but he also did not seek them out. And over time that distance was no longer temporary, but became part of the way he existed. The sad thing was not that he was lonely, but that he learned to get used to loneliness too early, to the point where it no longer made him feel lacking, but became a normal state, a place where he felt safer than in the middle of complicated relationships. And it was from here that a person began to take shape, a person who did not rely on emotions to move forward, but on discipline, who did not seek connection to feel complete, but sought perfection to feel in control. And although that choice took him to the top, it also quietly took away things that later, when looking back, might not be easy to find again. And from the foundation of a childhood accustomed to self-reliance and silence, Nick Faldo's journey gradually moved into another phase, where passion was no longer just initial curiosity or interest, but began to turn into something deeper, heavier, and almost uncontrollable, when golf was no longer a part of his life, but became the sole center around which every thought, every action, and every choice revolved. He began to practice with an intensity that even his peers could hardly understand. Those long practice hours were not only to improve skills, but to eliminate every smallest mistake, every unnecessary movement, every moment of lost focus. And that did not come from external pressure, but from the way he viewed himself. A view that did not allow mediocrity to exist, did not accept doing just good enough, but always demanded to be more accurate, better, more perfect. Those days did not have as many colors as the youth of others, with no gatherings, no relationships nurtured over time, no breaks to enjoy the lightness of life, because even when he was not holding a club, his mind was still thinking about the next shot, about stance, about hand pressure, about how the ball would roll on the grass, and that continuous repetition made his world gradually shrink to a single goal, a straight line with no room for distraction and no room for emotions unrelated to becoming better. This did not happen suddenly, but gradually, day by day, week by week, year by year, until even he no longer realized that he had stepped too far from what was called a balanced life. Friends gradually became distant names, not because he actively left them, but because he no longer had the time or energy to maintain those connections. Conversations became shorter, meetings became rarer, and then disappeared unnoticed, while the golf course became the only place where he felt he belonged, where everything could be measured, controlled, and improved through effort, completely different from the outside world where emotions and people were always unpredictable, and that difference made him choose more and more to stay in his familiar space, where he did not need to explain, did not need to perform, only to focus and keep moving forward. A very quiet, but very clear truth began to form in him, that if he wanted to reach the top, he could not live like normal people. And once he accepted that, he also accepted the trade-offs, trading time, trading relationships, trading experiences that others considered necessary for growth, in exchange for progress in a single field. And the remarkable thing was that at that time he did not feel he was losing anything, because in his world everything was measured by one single standard, whether it helped him become better on the golf course or not. It was from here that the mindset of control began to take deep root in the way he viewed everything, not just the swing or foot placement, but every smallest detail that could affect the result. He began to analyze everything meticulously, from weather conditions and course conditions to his own mental state, and gradually that control did not stop at technique, but spread to the way he lived, the way he thought, and the way he faced the world. He did not let things happen naturally, but always tried to adjust, shape, and keep them within a framework he considered correct, and this helped him become outstanding on the course. But at the same time, made him increasingly difficult to fit in with things he could not control outside of life. When looking back, it can be seen that this was the stage when passion truly turned into a form of obsession, not in an easily recognizable negative sense, but as an absolute dedication to the point where everything else gradually became secondary, and although that laid the foundation for later successes, it also quietly created a void that was not loud, not immediately painful, but large enough to follow him for many years afterward, when he stood at the top and realized that there were things that, once let go, would not be easy to find again, no matter how hard he tried. But just when everything seemed to be on the right track, when Nick Faldo began to assert his position in the golf world through rare stability and discipline, he made a decision that many at the time could not understand. A decision that was not only risky, but could destroy everything he had built, completely changing his swing technique under the guidance of David Leadbetter. Not small adjustments, not partial improvements, but breaking down almost the entire old foundation to rebuild from scratch, a choice that even experienced golfers rarely dared to make. Because in golf, stability is often considered the key, and any major change could send a career off course in an irreparable way. At that time, Faldo was not an unknown who needed to take risks to find opportunities. He already had a position, some reputation, and achievements sufficient to continue safely on his path. But something inside him did not allow that to happen. A feeling that what he was doing was still not enough, that there were small technical flaws that, if not corrected, would forever prevent him from reaching true greatness. And that very thought led him to an almost lonely decision, where he accepted stepping back to have a chance to go further, even though no one could guarantee it would succeed. What happened afterward was not easy at all. His form began to decline noticeably. His shots were no longer as accurate as before. The familiar feel with the club seemed to disappear, and the competition results reflected that undeniably. From a player considered stable, he became a name full of uncertainty. And in a world where success is measured by results, this change quickly attracted the attention of the media and experts. Questions began to appear, doubts grew, and not a few people thought he had made a mistake, that he had destroyed himself in an unnecessary effort. For a person accustomed to controlling everything, losing that stability was not just a technical issue, but a major psychological challenge. Every time he stepped onto the course was facing uncertainty. Every shot was a test where the outcome was no longer in the safe zone. And in that situation, many people might have returned to the old path, choosing familiarity to save their career. But Faldo did not. He continued on the path he had chosen, even though it became increasingly isolating, with fewer voices of support around him and only doubts and pressure left. His practice sessions during this period were no longer ordinary training hours, but long periods full of challenges where he had to repeat the new movements over and over, correct every smallest detail, accept the uncomfortable feeling, accept that he looked like a completely different person from before. And that did not happen in a few weeks or months, but stretched over many years, a period long enough to make anyone begin to doubt themselves. But Faldo kept going, without fanfare, without much explanation, without seeking sympathy, only quietly doing what he believed was necessary. That silence was not a sign of calm, but the way he faced pressure in his own manner, not letting it show outwardly, not letting it interrupt the process he had committed to. And that very silence made the distance between him and the world around him even greater. When others looking in only saw the declining results and did not see what was happening behind the scenes, did not see the level of commitment he was giving to changing himself. And for a long time it seemed that all those efforts only led him closer to the risk of losing the entire career he had spent years building. There were times when the only choice left seemed to be to turn back, to accept that he had gone too far, that this change was not worth continuing. But Faldo did not do that, not because he did not see the risks, but because he could not accept stopping before reaching the standard he had set for himself. And that made this decision one of the most important turning points in his life, not because it immediately brought success, but because it clearly showed who he was, a man willing to trade safety, accept isolation, and face the possibility of complete failure just to pursue a better version of himself, even if the price of that journey could be everything he had. And then, after the years of almost erasing himself to rebuild from scratch, Nick Faldo's changes finally began to show results. Not in a loud or explosive way right away, but through gradual improvement. Each shot became more stable, each round had fewer mistakes, and most importantly, the sense of control he had always sought began to return. This time, not confidence based on old habits, but a new foundation built through discipline, patience, and a much higher level of precision. When good results started appearing on the leaderboard and titles gradually returned, Faldo not only regained his position, but also moved closer to the greatness he had pursued from the beginning, a greatness that was no longer a vague dream, but a clear goal within reach. But right at the moment when the world began to see him as a winner, another person was also gradually forming behind those titles, a person who had to live at the pace his career imposed on him. When the competition schedule became dense with constant travel between major tournaments, endless practice sessions to maintain form, and increasing pressure as external expectations rose, each time he stepped onto the course was no longer just a match, but a continuous test of the perfection he had sacrificed so much to achieve. And in such an environment, there was not much room for rest, and even less room for things unrelated to winning. Life began to revolve around a familiar but harsh cycle. Competing, practicing, traveling, preparing for the next tournament, and in that cycle other things were gradually pushed aside, not because Faldo deliberately abandoned them, but because he no longer had enough time and energy to keep them. Family, friends, relationships that once existed all began to become more distant, not because of clear conflicts, but because his presence became less and less. Moments when he should have been there were replaced by practice sessions or flights, and over time, that distance was no longer temporary but became a permanent part of his life. The first cracks in his personal life did not come like a storm but quietly, in interrupted conversations, in unavoidable absences, in the feeling that even when they were together, Faldo still belonged to another world, a world where every thought was directed toward the next shot, the next tournament, the way to maintain the position he had paid so much to achieve, and that made those around him gradually feel they were no longer a priority for him, even though in Faldo's mind he had never truly wanted to lose them. There was one truth he probably understood better than anyone. To keep what he had achieved, he could not slow down, could not loosen control, could not allow himself to become comfortable. Because in elite golf, even a small deviation could create a big gap, and that very fear made him continue to maintain the harsh pace, to continue putting his career above everything else, not because he did not value the rest, but because he believed that if he lost his career, he would lose everything. And in that choice, he gradually redefined his life in a very clear way, where everything had to serve a single goal. His career was no longer a part of life, but became all of life. And when that happened, every decision, big or small, was weighed based on whether it helped him get closer to victory or not. Things that did not fit that criterion were gradually eliminated, not through sudden decisions, but through repeated prioritization, until things that were once important no longer stayed long enough to hold their place. And although this process did not cause an immediate shock, it created a profound change in the way he existed. A change that only when looking back did people realize that to become the Nick Faldo the world knew, he had had to give up more than what could be seen on the surface. And perhaps what makes this story heavy is not that he chose his career, but that he did it so absolutely without leaving much space for other things to exist in parallel, because in his world there was no concept of balance, only moving forward or falling behind. And to always move forward, he had accepted to live in a state where everything was placed under control, even his own life, a choice that took him to the top, but also quietly shaped the losses that later, even if he realized them, he could not go back to change. And then, when all the trade-offs began to crystallize into moments that any golfer would dream of, Nick Faldo entered the stage where his name was etched into history, with victories at the Open Championship and the Masters Tournament, titles that not only confirmed his class but also proved that the path he had chosen, though lonely and full of risks, finally led to greatness. But what made people remember Faldo was not just the trophies, but the way he stood there after each victory. Not exploding with emotion, not collapsing in feelings, not running around the course in excitement like many other champions, but simply a handshake, a slight nod, an almost unchanged gaze, as if he had just completed a preset task rather than achieved something extraordinary. In the moments when millions of people were watching, expecting a display of joy, Faldo instead showed an almost absolute control. Not because he felt nothing, but because he seemed not to allow himself to feel too much. Because for him, victory was not the end point, but only a part of the process, a necessary step to get closer to the standard he had set long before, and this very perspective made moments that should have been emotional peaks become quiet, almost empty to outsiders. This became even clearer in the major tournaments, where the pressure was highest and the reward was greatest, when each of Faldo's shots was not only tactical, but also reflected a mindset trained over many years, a mindset that did not allow mistakes, did not allow emotions to interfere. And when he won, it was not the result of a momentary explosion, but the consequence of a long process full of control, where every factor was calculated, every risk was minimized, and every decision served a single goal: victory. But that absolute focus on technique created a distance between him and the very moments he had achieved, when joy no longer came naturally, but was filtered through the lens of discipline and control, making it faint, hard to grasp, and sometimes almost non-existent. And this was not something he showed outwardly, but a feeling that gradually formed inside, when victory no longer brought the clear satisfaction people imagined. For many people, winning a major might be the peak of a career, a moment enough to define an entire life. But for Faldo, each victory was quickly placed into another context, where it became the new standard rather than the final achievement. And when that repeated, the feeling of attainment was gradually replaced by the feeling of having to maintain, to continue, to prove that the victory was not luck, but the result of a system he had built. And in that system, there was no room for complacency. Those who followed him could see a cold champion, a man who did not show emotion, but behind that image was a person who had become accustomed to suppressing, accustomed to not letting himself be carried away by momentary moments, because he understood that losing control for even one moment could change everything. And that very fear, though unspoken, had become part of the way he experienced success. Faldo's success, therefore, carried a very different shade. Not complete joy, but a state between achievement and having to continue, between external recognition and internal demands, and in that state it was very difficult to find a stopping point, a moment where he could truly say he had had enough, had completed it, and could let go, because as soon as one tournament ended, the thought of the next had already begun. As soon as one title was raised, the pressure to defend it had already appeared. And perhaps that was the biggest paradox in his journey, that when standing at the top, where everything should have brought the greatest satisfaction, he had to live in a state that did not allow him to stop and feel. A state where victory was not a reward, but a requirement, not an end, but a continuation. And in that endless continuation, the emotions that should have made the journey complete were gradually left behind, quietly and hard to notice, just like so many other things he had traded on the path to becoming a legend. And as the victories continued to accumulate, as Nick Faldo's name was increasingly mentioned with absolute respect, one other thing also became clearer. the distance between him and those around him not only did not narrow but grew even larger, not because he deliberately pushed people away, but because the way he existed seemed to leave little space for connection. In a world where golfers often built relationships based on empathy, shared moments after each round, and stories off the course, Faldo chose a different path, where he kept an almost absolute private space for himself, focusing on work, on technique, on self-improvement, and that made others, even though they respected him, still feel it was difficult to approach. This difference became clearer when placing him next to Save Ballesteros, one of his greatest rivals on the course, but also an almost completely opposite image in personality. Sev brought to golf a freedom, an explosive emotion, an ability to connect with the audience and those around him that Faldo seemed to lack. If Seva was the embodiment of inspiration and creativity, then Faldo was the symbol of discipline and control. If Sev attracted others with warmth and closeness, then Faldo kept distance with precision and silence. And this very contrast not only created memorable matches, but also shaped the way the public perceived them, one beloved, the other respected. For Faldo, being seen as hard to approach was not something he actively built. But it was also not something he tried to change, because in his world factors like closeness or friendliness were not priorities. He did not spend much time explaining himself, did not try to please others with words or gestures, and that made his image in the eyes of many people become cold, even overly calculating. A person who always considered everything from the angle of efficiency rather than emotion. A person whom even colleagues found unpredictable. Conversations with Faldo were usually brief, focused on professional matters, rarely going deep into personal things. And this was not because he had nothing to share, but because he was not used to putting his private parts in front of others. His personal life therefore became an almost closed area, where very few people were allowed in, and even when they were, they could hardly see his whole person. Because Faldo was not someone who easily revealed emotions. He kept everything inside, not like a clear defense, but like a habit formed long ago. Over time, that image gradually became an inseparable part of who he was. A person who always stood apart, not belonging to any group, not drawn into complicated relationships, but also not really having a place to call his own. And this created a very special feeling when looking at his journey. A feeling that even when he was in the middle of crowded golf courses, among cheering audiences, among competing opponents, Faldo still existed in his own space, a space where there was only him and his thoughts, the standards he set, and the goals he pursued. It can be said that the walls Faldo built around himself were not erected in one day, but were the result of many years of living in control, of putting his career above everything else, of learning not to depend on anyone. And once those walls were complete, they not only kept others outside, but also kept him inside, creating a certain safety, but at the same time limiting the ability to connect he could have with the world around him. And what makes this story even heavier is that those walls, while helping him become stronger on the course, did not bring him much outside the fairways, because while his career continued to develop, the voids in his personal life also gradually became clearer, not in the form of major incidents, but in the form of missing moments, relationships not nurtured, emotions not shared. And all those things, though not loud, contributed to shaping a life where greatness always came with a separation that was very difficult to erase. And when the walls around Nick Faldo had grown thick enough to keep the outside world at a safe distance, what remained inside was not peace, but an increasingly strict standard that he set for himself. A standard that did not stop at winning, but extended to the way of winning. The way of executing every shot with near absolute precision. And over time, that pursuit of perfection was no longer a goal, but became a constant state, where every smallest detail was scrutinized, from stance, swing rhythm, ball contacts to the feel when the ball left the club face. Nothing was allowed to happen randomly. There was no room for luck, because for Faldo, if a shot could not be explained, it was not reliable. This very way of thinking made him gradually drift away from the naturalness inherent in the game, where many golfers found inspiration in flexibility, in the ability to adapt, and sometimes in spontaneous moments. Faldo went in the opposite direction. He minimized every uncontrollable factor, turning each shot into the result of a carefully calculated process. And although this helped him achieve a level of consistency that very few could reach, it also made competing heavier, because every time he stepped onto the course, it was no longer an experience but a task demanding continuous precision, with no space to relax, no moment to simply enjoy. His training schedule therefore clearly reflected that not maintenance sessions, but periods designed to improve every smallest detail, where he repeated the same movement hundreds, thousands of times until it reached a level he felt acceptable. And even after achieving that, he still continued, because in his mind there was always a better version waiting to be discovered, a small flaw not yet completely eliminated. And that constant dissatisfaction became the drive, but at the same time the pressure he could never escape. This pressure did not come from the audience, did not come from the media, but from within, from the way he evaluated himself, from the standard he kept raising. And the remarkable thing was, there was no clear stopping point for that process, no milestone where he could say he had done enough, because as soon as he reached a certain level, he would see the next things that needed improvement, and that loop continued, keeping him always in a state of having to try harder, do better, be more precise, even though what he had achieved had already far surpassed most others. Over time, this pursuit of perfection began to take a different form, no longer just a tool to help him win, but became a framework he had to live within, a framework that did not allow mistakes, did not allow randomness, and that, while helping him maintain a high level of form, also caused him to lose a very important part of the game, the naturalness, the flexibility, and the sense of freedom when competing, elements that many golfers considered the source of joy. There were moments on the course where others might smile, might accept an imperfect shot and continue. Faldo looked at it as something that needed to be fixed, a mistake that needed to be eliminated. And this very approach made every round become a continuous evaluation process, where he was not only competing against opponents, but also against his own standard, a standard that no one else could impose on him, but no one else could help him ease either. Gradually, the perfection he pursued began to resemble a prison, not in the obvious sense of confinement, but as a space he had built himself and placed himself into, where everything had to be right, had to be precise, had to be controlled, and in that space, although he could achieve results that others admired, he did not have many opportunities to experience the simple emotions the game brought, because any loosening could be seen as a step backward. What makes this story heavy is not that he chose that path, but that he went so far on it that it was no longer easy to turn back. When perfection was no longer a goal ahead, but became a condition for existence, and in that condition, every day was a challenge. Every shot was a test, and even though he continued to win and continued to hold his position, there was still a feeling that he was paying for the precision he had pursued bit by bit, a price not expressed through clear failures, but through gradually losing the lightness, the naturalness, and the moments he could have felt if not bound by the very standard he had created. And when perfection had become a framework that could not be loosened, that not only shaped the way Nick Faldo competed, but also spread to the way he lived, the way he loved, and the way he made important choices in life, because when everything had to serve the goal of becoming better on the golf course, personal relationships were gradually placed in a secondary position, not because they were not important, but because they could not compete with the intensity and obsession he devoted to his career. And it was from here that the cracks began to appear more clearly, no longer the silent gaps as before, but becoming real breakdowns in his private life. Faldo's marriages did not break in a single moment, but in a prolonged process, where his presence became less and less, where conversations became rarer, where moments that should have been shared were replaced by training schedules, competition schedules, and endless travel. And over time, those who remained began to clearly feel that they were no longer the priority. That even when Faldo was physically present, his mind was still somewhere else, a place they could not enter, and that created a distance that could not always be filled with understanding or patience. There were decisions he made at important times, decisions that from a career perspective might have been reasonable or even necessary, but from a family perspective carried a very different meaning. Times when he chose to compete instead of being with loved ones. Times when he prioritized a tournament over a relationship that needed to be maintained. And although those choices may not have been made with the intention of causing hurt, they still left cracks that over time became hard to repair. Because in relationships, presence is not just being there, but also participation, sharing, and care. Things that Faldo, in his pace of life, found increasingly difficult to maintain. Those around him may have understood to some extent the path he was on, may have accepted the necessary sacrifices for him to achieve success, but there was a limit that any relationship had to face, and when the balance was broken for too long, understanding gradually gave way to fatigue, to the feeling of being left behind, and finally, to unavoidable decisions, separations not because of lack of affection, but because there were no longer enough conditions to continue, and when that happened more than once, it was no longer an isolated incident, but became part of the story of his life. Faldo's personal image, therefore, also began to be affected, not in the loud way of big scandals usually seen in the sports world, but in a quieter yet more persistent way. When the public began to see another side of him, not only as a disciplined and successful athlete, but also as a man with controversial decisions in his private life, and although his achievements on the course still held their value, the way people perceived him began to change. No longer pure admiration, but mixed with questions and thoughts about the price he had to pay, and others also had to pay in that journey. The further he advanced in his career, the harder Faldo found it to regain stability in his personal life, not because he did not want to, but because the structure of life he had built no longer had much space for it to exist when everything revolved around his career. Every adjustment had to serve the competition goal, and any factor that could disrupt focus was eliminated or minimized, even if that factor was an important relationship. And over time, this created a loop where the more successful he became, the more he had to maintain that state. And the more he maintained that state, the harder it was to rebuild what had been lost. There is a truth that perhaps only when looking back can people clearly realize that Faldo was not someone incapable of love or attachment, but someone who had placed himself in a situation where those things became very difficult to exist alongside what he was pursuing. And when forced to choose, he had many times chosen his career, not because he did not care about other things, but because he believed that was the only path to achieve what he wanted. And in that choice, he had accepted the accompanying consequences, even though they did not always appear immediately. And perhaps what makes this part of the story heavy is not the number of relationships that ended, but the way they ended, not in the explosion of conflict, but in prolonged silence, in distances that were not narrowed, in things that were not said at the right time. And when looking back, those losses could not be measured by numbers or specific events, but by the feeling that there were things that could have been different if the path he chose had not demanded so much. But once he had come this far, once he had become the man the world knew, turning back was no longer an option. And all that remained was to continue walking with what he had and what he had lost. And after all the quiet breakdowns in his private life, after the choices where career always came before affection, Nick Faldo's journey entered a moment where everything seemed to converge, not in peace, but in pressure that was almost unbearable. Because 1996 was not just a tournament, but a psychological test that stretched day by day, round by round, where victory was measured not only by technique, but also by the ability to hold himself together amid uncontrollable fluctuations. The 1996 Masters tournament began with a story that seemed already written when Greg Norman led with a gap that seemed almost impossible to close, a devastating form that made every other opponent fade, and Faldo, from behind, was not mentioned as a real threat. Because in the eyes of the public, this was Norman's tournament, the moment he would assert his position absolutely. But right there, in the position of someone no longer expected, Faldo entered a different state. No longer the tension of having to prove anything but absolute focus on every shot, every smallest decision, and throughout the first rounds, he did not create any explosion, did not draw attention, but only quietly maintained a steady rhythm, as if he was waiting for something only he could feel. A moment when everything could change. The pressure in the tournament came not only from the opponent, but also from history itself. From expectations accumulated over many years, from times of getting close to victory but not being able to touch it, and in that context, maintaining calm became the deciding factor, because any fluctuation could break the entire effort. And Faldo, with his almost extreme disciplined nature, kept an emotional distance large enough not to be swept into what was happening around him. When entering the final round, the gap was still there. But the pressure began to shift, no longer only on Faldo's shoulders, but gradually weighing on Norman, who had to defend his advantage against the unwavering steadiness from behind. And it was in that change that the story began to turn, not with a single shot, but with a series of small moments, where Faldo's stability contrasted completely with the mistakes that began to appear in his opponent, and step by step, the gap was closed. It was not an explosive comeback in the familiar dramatic style, but a slow yet irreversible process, where each precise shot from Faldo was like a steady knock on Norman's psychological pressure. And as the tournament approached the final holes, what had once been considered impossible became reality, when Faldo took the lead, not by luck, but by persistence and absolute control throughout the entire process. That victory, one of the most memorable comebacks in golf history, should have been an emotional explosion, a release after many years of pursuit. But Faldo's reaction went in a completely different direction, when he did not show excessive excitement, had no strong celebratory gestures, but only an almost cold calm, as if this was not the peak of his career, but simply the inevitable result of what he had done. That image, for many people, could create a feeling of detachment, even incomprehension, because in a moment when most people would let emotions pour out, Faldo kept it inside, as he had done with so many things in his life, and that clearly reflected a part of who he was. A man who did not easily reveal what was happening inside, a man who had become accustomed to controlling emotions as part of existence, but that very control also raised a question, whether in the greatest moment of his life he truly felt joy fully, or whether that victory, no matter how big, was still just another point in a journey where he did not allow himself to stop and enjoy. And if looking back at the earlier part of the story, when personal relationships gradually broke, when private life lacked stability, then this moment, though brilliant on the surface, still carried a certain emptiness within it. The victory at the 1996 Masters was therefore not only a milestone in his career, but also a symbol of the way Faldo approached life, where success did not come with emotional expression, where the peak did not mean satisfaction, and where even in the most memorable moment he still kept a certain distance from his own emotions, as if that was the only way for him to continue existing in the world he had chosen. And perhaps what made this moment special was not just that he had won, but the way he had won, and the way he had received it, the greatest victory, but covered by the deepest silence, like a clear mark for the man he had become, a man who even when standing at the top still did not fully belong there, still kept a distance, not only from the world around him, but also from his own joy. After the moment that seemed to define his entire career at the 1996 Masters tournament, When Nick Faldo stood at the top with a historic victory over Greg Norman, what remained was not an explosion of affection from the public, but something more complex, a state where he was respected almost absolutely but never truly loved in the way many others in the same generation received. In the world of professional golf, Faldo was not only seen as a champion, but also as a symbol of standards, a man whom colleagues, coaches, and experts all had to acknowledge for his seriousness, discipline, and near-perfect ability to control, because he was not the type who won through momentary inspiration, but through a meticulously built system of thinking over many years, where every swing and every strategy was calculated with near-absolute precision. That very thing made him a model highly regarded by professionals, because in a sport where the psychological factor played a decisive role, Faldo represented a standard not everyone could reach, a combination of technique, patience, and the ability to endure pressure that only those who truly understood the sport could fully appreciate. But those same qualities also created an invisible distance between him and the general audience, because while many fans sought emotions, moments of personality expression, and human stories, Faldo appeared like a machine programmed to win, an image so perfect it became hard to approach, hard to empathize with. Unlike golfers who carried emotional explosions, who could laugh loudly, celebrate wildly, or even show disappointment clearly, Faldo almost always kept a layer of control, where emotions were suppressed and hidden, and that, while making him admirable, did not help him become closer in the eyes of the public. For many years, his image in the media did not change much, still a cold, focused, quiet man, and sometimes somewhat distant, not because he lacked emotions, but because he did not allow those emotions to become part of his public image. And in an era where personal connection became increasingly important, that unintentionally placed him in a special position, admired but not widely loved. This does not mean he had no fans, but that the way he was perceived was different from many other stars, because instead of creating attachment based on emotion, Faldo created respect based on ability, and those two things, although they could exist together, did not always go hand in hand. This distance became even clearer when compared with other figures in the same period, people who could turn every victory into a story and every failure into a moment for the audience to feel. While with Faldo, everything always seemed kept at a certain level of control, without exaggeration, without dramatization, only precision and efficiency, and in a way that reflected the man himself, a person who had spent most of his life perfecting himself according to very high standards, to the point where everything else, including the way he connected with the outside world, was also influenced by the same principle, that emotions needed to be controlled, that stability was more important than expression. But what was the price of that control if not a certain level of isolation? Because when a person always kept a distance from emotions, they also created distance from those around them. And in Faldo's case, this was shown not only in his personal life, but also in the way he was perceived by the public. He could step onto a golf course with respect from everyone, from opponents to spectators, but when he left, what remained was not deep attachment, but an impression of perfection, of a high standard that others found hard to reach, but also hard to feel close to. It was a paradox that not everyone noticed immediately, that a person could reach the peak of his career, be widely recognized for talent and contribution, but still not truly become a figure loved in the emotional sense. And in Faldo's story, that was not a failure, but the natural consequence of the path he had chosen. Because to become who he had become, he had to sacrifice many things, not only in his personal life, but also in the way he presented himself to the world. And when looking back, it can be seen that the respect he received was completely deserved. But the affection he did not receive was also not accidental, but part of the price he had accepted from very early on. And therefore, when moving past the peak of 1996, Faldo did not only carry the title, but also a special position in the history of this sport, a position where he was looked up to as a standard, but not always embraced as a close symbol, a man whom everyone respected, but only a few truly felt they could understand and love. And then, after all the years at the top, carrying respect but also a distance not easy to erase with the world around him, Nick Faldo came to a decision that any athlete must face. But for him, it was not only stopping but leaving a part of himself that had defined him for decades. When he gradually closed his professional playing career, not in a sudden moment, but in a process where his body, time, and his own inner feeling began to change, where maintaining the strict standard as before could no longer be sustained forever. And although that decision could be seen as reasonable, it still carried a void that was very hard to fill, because when a person had become accustomed to living under pressure, stepping out of it did not mean immediately finding relief. After stepping away from the golf course as a competitor, Faldo did not completely disappear from the sport that had made his name but moved to another role, becoming a commentator for CBS Sports, where he continued to be connected with the major tournaments, but in a completely different position, no longer the one directly holding the club, but the one observing, analyzing, and interpreting what was happening on the course. And in this role, the qualities that had made Faldo in his playing career were once again shown: meticulousness, focus on details, the ability to read situations, and deep understanding of strategy, all helping him become a reliable voice, someone the audience could listen to in order to understand more clearly what was happening. But even though he still appeared in the golf world, his life at this time had changed markedly. With no more dense competition schedules, no more hours-long practice sessions, no more pressure to prove himself through every shot. Instead, a slower, quieter rhythm of life where days were no longer divided by short-term goals. And in that quietness, there was a feeling of both relief and emptiness, because when a person had become accustomed to every moment having clear meaning, facing a period of time not dominated by specific goals sometimes became another challenge. Faldo was not someone who sought attention off the course, and after retirement he appeared even less in social activities, did not participate much in symbolic events or spaces where former athletes often gathered to maintain their image. He chose a more discreet way of existing, where his presence did not need to be emphasized, where he could keep a private space he had been accustomed to from long before, and this made his image in the eyes of the public even quieter, like a chapter that had closed without needing too much explanation. In his role as commentator, his style still kept the same calm and control, with no strong emotional comments, no exaggeration, but analyses based on deep understanding of the game. And this, for some audiences, might lack appeal. But for those who truly cared about golf, it carried a different value. A value coming from precision, from the way he viewed the match from the perspective of someone who had once experienced everything happening on the course. Faldo's life after the spotlight was therefore not a colorful transformation, but a continuation in a gentler way, where he still kept his nature but in a different context, with less pressure, less demand, and also fewer moments that could create strong emotions. And in that change, one thing could be seen clearly, that no matter how circumstances change, the man himself did not change much, still a person of control, a person who revealed little, a person who chose to exist in quietness rather than in noise. But that very quietness also carried a question not easy to answer, that when there were no longer big goals to pursue, when there were no longer challenges forcing him to push his own limits, what would fill the remaining void, and whether this peace truly brought a feeling of completeness or was simply another state of loneliness, where there was no longer external pressure but thoughts from within still continued to exist. Not loudly, but enough to make him realize that the journey he had been through, no matter how great, had also left voids that could not always be filled just by silence. And in that quietness, when the rhythm of life was no longer swept away by competition schedules or goals to conquer, Nick Faldo began to have more time to look back at the journey he had taken, a journey spanning many decades, from the boy who first held a club after watching the Masters tournament to the man who stood at the top of world golf. And when looking back, it could not be denied that what he had achieved was extraordinary. 6 major titles, victories at the Open Championship and the Masters Tournament, years at the peak of competition, appearances in the European team at the Ryder Cup, all creating a career that any athlete could be proud of. A legacy, not only in the trophies but also in the way he had changed how people understood standards in golf. A career built through discipline, through persistence, and through a willpower not easily shaken. But when the light of those achievements receded into the background, other things began to appear more clearly, not in the form of big, obvious mistakes, but as voids, parts of life that had not been lived fully, relationships that had once existed but could not be kept, people who had entered his life and then quietly left when the distance became too great. And the sad thing was, there was not always a specific moment to say that was when everything changed, but a prolonged process where prioritizing career gradually pushed other things away until they no longer stayed long enough to be kept. There were periods of time he had missed, not because he did not care, but because he had chosen a path that did not allow him to stop. Moments that could have been for family, for loved ones, for simple experiences of life, instead replaced by practice sessions, trips, tournaments that at that time seemed more important than anything else. And when looking back, those choices were not wrong, but also not completely without consequences, because time is something that cannot be taken back, and what has been missed can never be recreated in the same way. What made the process of looking back difficult was not facing what had been achieved, but facing what had been lost, because while achievements could be recorded and honored, losses existed in silence, with no titles to compensate, no recognition to soothe the feeling that there were things that had passed and could not be returned, and that very silence made them heavier over time. Faldo was not someone who easily revealed his thoughts, and even when facing the past, he was not someone who talked much about what could have been different. But in the way he existed, in the silences between his public appearances, a certain reflection could be felt, a realization that the path he had chosen, although it took him to the top, had also shaped his life in a way that could not be changed. And in it, there were not only things to be proud of, but also things that could not be taken back. He may not have regretted in a clear way, because to become the man he had become, those choices were almost inevitable. But that did not mean he did not realize what had been left behind. And that very realization, although not spoken much, still existed as part of the journey, a part not mentioned when people talked about the victories, but clearly present when people looked at his entire life, the relationships that no longer existed, the periods of time that had passed, the moments that could not be returned, all created a picture that was not completely whole, a picture in which greatness and loss existed side by side, not canceling each other, but supplementing each other to create a fuller story, a story that was not only about success, but also about its price. And when standing at the present moment, looking back at everything, Faldo was no longer the person running after goals ahead, but the person facing what had passed, not to change, but to understand more clearly about himself, about the choices that had brought him here, and about the real meaning of that journey, a journey where every step forward came with a trade-off. And when looking back, what remained was not only what he had achieved, but also the way he accepted everything that had happened, both the good and the incomplete, as an inseparable part of the man he had become. And when the memories had been arranged again in silence, when what had been achieved and what had been lost gradually appeared more clearly in the same view, Nick Faldo's story began to move to a deeper layer, where it was no longer just recounting the journey, but understanding the real price of that journey. A price not always mentioned when people talked about success, because on the surface the titles, the victories at the Open Championship or the Masters Tournament were enough to define a brilliant life. But behind those symbols was a chain of prolonged, quiet trade-offs not easy to measure. Those trade-offs did not happen at a specific time, but accumulated through each year, each decision, each time prioritizing career over something more personal, And when looking back, it could be seen that Faldo's success was not the result of a few outstanding moments, but the result of a lifestyle where everything was placed under the control of a single goal. And in that lifestyle, there was not much room for randomness, not much space for things that did not directly serve becoming better on the golf course. This created a clear difference between professional success and personal life, because while his career was built on the foundation of discipline, precision, and the ability to endure pressure, personal life required other elements, required flexibility, sharing, emotional presence, things that could not always exist alongside a harsh schedule and a standard that was constantly raised. And when these two worlds could not find a point of balance, one of them had to suffer, and in Faldo's case, the choice had been made very clearly from very early on. The pressure in his life, therefore, came not only from tournaments or public expectations, but also from himself, from the way he viewed his own value, from the standard he never allowed himself to lower. And the remarkable thing was that pressure did not disappear when he left the course. It only changed form, from having to prove himself through every shot to having to face thoughts about the past, about what he had done and what he had not done, about choices that no longer had the chance to be tried differently. There is a question not easy to answer when looking at Faldo's journey, whether everything he had achieved brought a feeling of completeness or not. Because, if only looking at the results the answer seemed to be yes, he had reached a peak very few could touch, had left an indelible mark in golf history. But if looking at the entire life that question became more complex, when great achievements existed side by side with voids not easy to fill, when greatness came with separation, and when what he had did not completely compensate for what he had lost, this does not diminish the value of what he had achieved, but on the contrary makes his story more real, closer to the nature of life, where success rarely comes without a price. And that price is not always paid immediately, but sometimes only appears when the journey has passed, when there is nothing left to pursue ahead, and when a person begins to have time to look back. From Faldo's perspective, success may not be a destination, but a continuous process of striving, of pushing limits, of accepting trade-offs that cannot always be clearly explained. And in that process, the value of success lies not only in what is recorded, but also in the way it shapes the person, the way it changes the way we view the world and ourselves. And perhaps the most important thing when looking at this story is not evaluating whether those choices were right or wrong, but understanding that every path has its own price. And in Faldo's case, the path to greatness required a level of commitment not everyone could accept, a level of sacrifice not everyone was willing to face. And that very thing makes his story not only the story of a champion, but also the story of a man who had lived the way he believed was necessary, even though that meant carrying voids that could not always be filled. And when all the layers of memories, achievements, and losses gradually settled, Nick Faldo's story appeared not only as the journey of an outstanding athlete, but as a life shaped by very clear, very decisive choices that almost never turned back. From the boy who first held a club after watching the Masters tournament, to the man who stood at the top with 6 major titles, victories at the Open Championship, years conquering the harshest golf courses in the world, and then stepping out of the competition lights to become a calm, analytical voice on CBS Sports, all creating an almost straight line without deviation, a journey where every step was weighed based on a single standard: become better, more precise, and closer to the perfection he always pursued. In golf history, Faldo's position is not up for debate. He was not only a champion with specific titles, but one of those who changed the way people understood preparation, strategy, and the ability to control oneself under pressure, a standard that many later generations had to learn from. And although there were others who brought creativity, inspiration, or emotional explosion, Faldo brought something else: a certainty, a precision, and a discipline that, when maintained long enough, could take a person to the top without having to rely on unstable factors. But those very qualities were also the factors that shaped his entire life, not only on the golf course but outside of life as well. Because when a person had chosen the path of absolute control, they could not easily live differently in other areas. And Faldo had many times made choices in which his career always stood in the priority position, not because he did not recognize the value of other things, but because he understood that to maintain what he had built, he could not allow himself to be distracted, could not let emotions lead. And in that choice he had created a very consistent life, but also a very separate one. Now, when no longer standing in the middle of decisive rounds, no longer having to face the pressure of every shot, Faldo's image became more subdued, not loud, not seeking attention, not trying to change the way others perceived him. He appeared when necessary, said what needed to be said, then returned to his own space, a life no longer dominated by goals to achieve, but still carrying the habits, thoughts, and standards formed over many years. And in that subdued state, there was a very clear feeling that he had accepted who he was, not trying to become a different version, not trying to compensate for what had been lost with sudden changes. This acceptance was not resignation, but the result of a journey long enough to understand that no path is perfect in every sense, that every choice carries unavoidable consequences, and that the value of life lies not only in what is achieved, but also in the way we face what has happened, both the good and the incomplete. And in Faldo's case, that meant looking back at the achievements with pride, but also looking at the losses with acknowledgement, without denial, without avoidance. He may not have been someone who brought a feeling of closeness like many other legends. He may not have created strong emotional moments that made the audience explode, but that did not diminish the value of the journey he had been through. Because not every story needs to be told through expressed emotions. There are stories written in silence, in persistence, and in choices repeated over many years, and Faldo's story belonged to that type. A story that was not loud, but deep enough that when looking back, people could feel its full weight. And perhaps the final thing remaining is not the question of whether he could have done differently, but the understanding that he had lived true to the path he chose, a path leading to greatness, but also accompanied by voids that not everyone was willing to accept. And in that combination, Nick Faldo's image became more complete. Not only a champion, but a man who had chosen greatness and accepted to live with everything that came with it, without avoidance, without regret, only quietly, continuing in the rest of his life with a calm that only those who had been through enough could understand. Nick Faldo's story leaves a very quiet, sad feeling, not because he failed, but because he succeeded in a way that made a person pay too high a price. When looking back at the journey from the bold decision to completely change his technique with David Ledbetter, accepting the trade-off in form and reputation to rebuild from scratch, to the historic victory at the 1996 Masters tournament over Greg Norman, where he almost did not show emotion, we clearly see a man who had become accustomed to control to the point of not allowing himself to enjoy even the greatest moment of his life. And that very thing creates a poignant feeling, because success should have brought joy. But for Faldo, it was more like a duty to be fulfilled than a dream to be touched. Details like him gradually losing relationships, broken marriages, or the way he always kept distance from the world around him show that the price of perfection lies not only in effort, but also in things that could not be kept. And when he stepped into the post-career stage with the role of commentator at CBS Sports, living in quietness, the story became even clearer that there are victories that do not come with completeness. For the American people, where culture always values personal success, this story is a very real reminder that winning isn't everything if it causes you to lose balance. That a career, no matter how important, should not completely replace family, emotions, and human connections. And the biggest lesson is not to give up ambition, but to understand its limits, to know when to stop to live. Because if not, you may achieve everything the world admires, but not feel the real meaning of what you have achieved. If the story of Nick Faldo makes you think about the price of success, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate that journey full of sacrifice. Thank you for following, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the stories behind the halo that not everyone sees.